So, Schedule 1, which is considered the worst form of drugs, would be things like heroin. And unfortunately, cannabis is on there too. Category 2 or Schedule 2 would be things like cocaine and methamphetamines. So, major serious drugs are actually ranked below in the eyes of the DEA and under the Act than compared to cannabis. Now, a lot of investors cannot own cannabis stocks. It may not even be the exchange. It may be that their custodian forbids it. It may be that they're with an advisor, and the advisor, as a course of policy, won't touch it. Say the top 5 firms, cannabis firms, owe something like $1 billion to the IRS. And this is put in perspective. The largest market cap of these companies is probably around $1 billion. So that's a big deal. They owe a lot of money.
Welcome, everyone. This is Mariusz Konieczny. Today I have a special guest, Christopher Casey from Windrock, and we're going to talk some cannabis. So, Chris, thank you very much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You know, I looked at your firm, your money management firm, and I got to tell you that I am a little bit surprised because you're very much not like the other money managers, I have to say. You invest in things that are off the beaten path, and usually money managers like to just stick to the plain vanilla investments. I was wondering if you can talk about this a bit.
Well, you're certainly true that the industry itself is what I describe as kind of ossified, right? For the most part, I think most wealth managers kind of do and say the exact same thing. We are different. In fact, I think the tagline we have right now, our latest kind of slogan, if you will, is a different choice in wealth management. And I think we certainly are. And it's primarily for 2 reasons. One is that we're much more willing to embrace private investments, a lot of, including things like cryptocurrencies or precious metals or things like that. And a lot of wealth managers are not solely for the reason that they feel like they can't adequately benchmark it, right? So that's all they're focused on is beating a so-called benchmark. On the other side of the coin, what makes us different is that I think we're also have much more independent or well thought out or internally produced views on the markets and the economy. And most wealth managers do. Do not, I should say. They will simply parrot what the Fed says, probably at best. At worst, they have no opinion. And I've actually seen major wealth management firms at conferences. If you ask them a question like, hey, are you concerned about a recession? And they'll say things like, we never even think about it, right? That doesn't concern us. You have to be fully invested. So they just, in general, we have different opinions on the economy, financial markets, and we're much more willing to embrace investments that other firms would, I'd say, categorically refuse for illegitimate reasons.
Mm-hmm. And so I listened to your interview that you did on cannabis. And then I reached out to you because I'm also involved in some stocks in cannabis. So talk to us about why you got interested in cannabis and maybe how long you've been invested in the space.
Well, it's been a story we've been following for some time, at least since 2012 when Colorado passed recreational cannabis usage. So it's something we've followed for a long time. We've looked at some private investments over the years, and we certainly have been following the public markets of these stocks, and that's intrigued us. However, the timing has never been all that right. We were in it a little bit in the past for some clients, but we didn't have a strong conviction in investment thesis, I think, until really recently. And part of that's just because these stocks have sold off so much. And part of it was because we think there are some things coming down the pike which will change their situations financially, operationally, et cetera.
What changed recently?
Well, most recently, Trump was on record speaking to reporters a couple weeks ago. I think it was the 10th or 11th of this month, basically saying, hey, we're considering rescheduling this, and I hope to have it wrapped up in a few weeks. Now, the downside is, he said, it's a complicated situation. And it shouldn't be when you're talking about rescheduling, because I think it's pretty clear that it should be rescheduled.
What do you mean by rescheduling to those that don't understand the space?
Yeah. So according to the Controlled Substances Act of the early 70s, drugs that are illegal, or at least not necessarily illegal, but highly controlled, fall into different categories. They have 5 different schedules. And if it's not on the schedule, there's no problems. And each of these schedules is an ordinal versus a cardinal ranking, right? You can't necessarily say one drug is quantifiably worse than another, but they have different criteria that guides how drugs fall into these five categories. And the criteria would be the likelihood of abuse, it would be the likelihood of dependency, and it would be the benefit, if any, or the magnitude of the benefit, if any, uh, from a medicinal standpoint. And so, to put it in perspective, probably the best way to do it, we could sit here and talk about all the different definitions, but the best way is just to show examples. So, Schedule One, which is considered the worst form of drugs, would be things like heroin. And unfortunately, cannabis is on there too. It's the same category. Now, Category Two or Schedule Two would be things like cocaine, um, and methamphetamines. So major serious drugs are actually ranked below in the eyes of the DEA and under the act than compared to cannabis. At the far end, Schedule Five, you're going to have things like some actually anti-diarrhea drugs, right? So it's pretty benign stuff, but that's kind of the hierarchy of the rankings. And right now, Trump's comments, the current speculation is that he was talking about moving it from a Schedule One to a Schedule Three, which has some pronounced changes, which would impact companies.
So because cannabis is categorized as Schedule One, what kind of repercussions do these businesses have because of that classification?
Yeah, the most onerous one, and the one that they could achieve some immediate relief, is the fact that according to the IRS code, Section 280E, these firms for Schedule One or Two are prohibited from deducting basic business expenses in the calculation of their taxes. So, ironically, they're able to deduct their inventory, which is illegal, but that's what they're able to deduct, right? It's crazy. But payroll, paying their accountant, paying their utilities, paying their rent, these are considered non-deductible expenses. And so what happens is they're basically taxed at their gross margin levels, which means their effective rate of tax is far, far higher than it would be from a true operational, traditional business standpoint.
Okay, so you're saying that when cannabis gets reclassified to Schedule 3, they would be able to deduct regular business expenses like regular businesses can. Are there any other benefits that would bring the rescheduling to these businesses other than these deductions?
Yeah, right now the industry is hampered by three main limitations. One is the tax situation, according to 280E. And that is one that offers immediate relief if they reschedule it. Because it's estimated right now, I read some articles where, say, the top five firms, cannabis firms, owe something like $1 billion to the IRS. And this is, to put in perspective, the largest market cap of these companies is probably around $1 billion. So that's a big deal. They owe a lot of money. And hopefully it'd be, even though the Constitution outlaws ex post facto laws, the tax code is treated differently. So hopefully you get some relief retroactively a bit. So that's one item. The other two may not be immediately fixed, but I think it creates a momentum effect once you reschedule it to fix these other issues. And the other issues is that right now you're not able to cross state lines, which creates some really horrible lack of efficiencies and ability to scale, reach different markets. And the third one, which is probably far less than the other two, the other two I consider 1 and 1A as far as problems. The third one is just a lack of access to capital, not being able to go to a traditional bank. So they got to go to credit unions, they got to go to private sector, they got to go to maybe a community bank and look for funds. And that's a big problem because any industry that's growing, requires massive amounts of working capital, requires capital expenditures. And if you can't access not even necessarily cheap capital, but just have access to capital, that's a big deal.
I find it on the topic of accessing capital, I find it so ridiculous that these companies cannot trade on the US exchanges. So they trade in Canada and OTC, but Canadian cannabis companies trade in the US.
That is true, and there's a number of them that is true. The access to capital, ironically, I was just thinking about this the other day. The fact that they don't have access to capital means there are private providers that have stepped in, right? And fairly what you would consider, well, if you're the lender, good terms, but if you're the borrower, fairly onerous terms, 10+%, that kind of thing. Who knows what the covenants are, et cetera. But the only reason I've never personally looked at lending money to a cannabis company or being involved in a fund that does that is because it could change overnight. If you get the passage of a particular act by Congress, that immediately opens up these uh, companies to access, various banks. When you do that, the whole idea of privately lending to them evaporates. So, ironically, the lack of capital is even worse off because things could change, and so it's even hampering the private capital that gets to these companies.
So from the point of view of an investor, so does it make sense to, let's say, one of the theses to have is to buy some of these stocks prior to uplisting to U.S. exchanges when the reform happens?
Yeah, that's another point. That is true. Right now, a lot of investors uh, cannot own cannabis stocks, and it may not even be the exchange. It may be that their custodian forbids it as a matter of policy. It may be that they're with an advisor, they're with a registered investment advisor, and the advisor, as a course of policy, won't touch it. I'm sure, very, very common. Um, so yes, reclassifying, having these companies meet different listing criteria to move up. I mean, it'd be much different story for these companies if they were listed on, for instance, the Nasdaq or some other exchange than where they're currently listed over the counter.
Because that would open up a brand new pool of investors, and that's one other thing that I'm surprised about your company, because I specifically focus myself on micro cap stocks, penny stocks, or the stocks that trade on OTC, which many of the cannabis stocks are forced to trade. And anytime I mention my stocks to the traditional financial industry, which is financial advisors, wealth managers, they look at me as if I have AIDS or something. Like, it's just so, and like, I'm just so shocked that there is a financial advisor out there that actually recommends some of these names to the clients. I'm just shocked.
Well, thanks. And by the way, join the club, because that's pretty common in the industry. And it's not just something so-called as exotic as cannabis. Most firms would look at you the same way if you even talked about precious metals, right? That's just not something that they would traditionally invest in, even though it's been around for thousands of years. It's considered a legitimate asset class by a lot of investors, but that would not be uncommon reaction. Now, that's not to say that, as you know, that we have to be careful when you're trading with thinly traded stocks or very small cap stocks, because when you're dealing with a lot of clients, it is sometimes difficult to enter and exit. And Buffett's the master at that, with large cap stocks, but it is very difficult to do that. So there is some rationale behind it, but in general, you're right. They just have a skewed view, and they would consider it just a strange perspective that you have.
So since you mentioned, precious metals, do you also get involved with some of the mining stocks? Because there's so connected, and if you are in the mining stocks, you are forced to deal with the secondary exchanges.
We do. Most of our clients do own miners. Now, that's not to say that we're not stock pickers per se. We tend to only use or pick individual stocks when there's lack of a really good alternative. So, for instance, in cannabis, it's a small enough market. We want to kind of choose what we're doing. For other industries, maybe so specialized, like just an ETF does not exist. We've seen that with a lot of commodity type entities, like natural gas, right? There's natural gas funds that actually invest in natural gas, but not that invest in natural gas companies. So that is an area we try to be careful on. As far as miners, we are in miners. We generally don't pick individual stocks, although we have. I actually went to school or did a class at the Colorado School of Mines, so I'm somewhat familiar how to do that. But in general, we'd probably rely on an ETF for that.
And then, so if we're talking back to cannabis, so how do you invest in cannabis? Do you invest in the MSOS ETF, or do you invest in the larger cannabis stocks? How do you enter that space?
Yeah, well, I'm prohibited from talking about any like individual company or individual security. I just can't do that. But what I would say is that when you look at this industry, if you look at it from like a Graham Dodd type perspective or any kind of valuation, um, classic valuation techniques that you're trying to assess which ones to buy, I would almost throw that out the window. Whenever an industry is down, and these stocks are down like 95%, even with the recent run up, they're still down massively, not only off their 52-week highs, but from their all time highs, they're off massively. When you have those situations, I view it as when you have that situation and when you have a real catalyst that could change things, right? If they reclassify to Schedule 3, that offers immediate relief to the entire industry, financial relief. When that kind of stuff happens, you could throw spaghetti against the fridge and it's gonna be fine, right? You don't have to necessarily be too choosy. I think it's more important to be in the market rather than how you are in the market.
Okay. Um, and in terms of your investment style, um, you know, how did you get into this space, and who influenced your investment thinking, your investment strategy, your investment style?
Oh boy, that's years probably in the making. It'd be hard to mention all the people that have really affected me personally, but certainly I think as a firm and for me personally, we're generally contrarians, right? We really think it's a great opportunity to make money when something's beat up and you're able to identify certain issues or criteria that will change that course either in real terms or from the perspective of other investors. When you have that catalyst that changes that, that's a pretty powerful investing style. Now, going back in time, people I followed, obviously, probably one of the first newsletters I ever read was like Doug Casey, no relation to me, but people like that I greatly admire. And they were definitely classic contrarians throughout their careers.
And what about Warren Buffett? Has he influenced your investment style at all?
He has, although my only issue with Warren Buffett is that I would think that he's moved far afield from his investment philosophy and what he originally planned on doing. Now, that's not necessarily a criticism of him. When you're the size of Berkshire Hathaway, it's almost impossible, right, to find the type of companies that he'd want to deploy funds that are more than a magnitude larger than the so-called market caps of the firms that met kind of his classic security analysis type of review. So it's not really a criticism of him, but he has changed quite a bit over the years, um, to the point where what he buys isn't necessarily a value play. He could see a value. He could maybe he sees a catalyst down the road, something will change the course. But I would say it's more. It went from buying beat up, undervalued stocks to things that are more fully valued and more from a growth type mentality for a large part.
Well, and also I remember during one of the Berkshire Hathaway meetings, he did say that if he was managing less money, his investment style would be completely different. He would more likely go towards the obscure type of opportunities because that's where the investment industry doesn't compete with. There's not a lot of competition.
Absolutely. And a lot of those stocks aren't being followed at all by sell side research. No one's even heard of them. They probably get very few calls. Actually, they probably don't even have an investor relations department, or if they do, they don't get a lot of calls. So, in general, yes, it's a great space to be in to exercise that kind of philosophy. But you're right; he's just too big to do it.
Yeah. Okay. So my final question is, do you have any final thoughts for my listeners? And if anybody wants to find out more about you, how could they reach out?
Yeah, well, probably the best way is either visit our website, which is windrockwealth.com. We post all of our research there, from day one. Really, we have a whole page dedicated to research, whether it's podcasts or articles we've written. We also try to put out things on X, which is at Windrock Wealth is our X handle. I'm not sure what they call that. Um, that's probably the easiest way to find us, to talk about not just about cannabis, but a whole range of issues, whether it's macroeconomic, whether it's cryptocurrencies. We've got a whole bunch of different topics up there.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for doing this.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you.